Serial killers have fascinated and terrified people for decades. While names like Bundy and Dahmer are infamous, there are others, lurking in the shadows of history, whose crimes are even more disturbing. Today, we're diving into the minds of 10 of the creepiest serial killers you've likely never heard of. Until now. Imagine walking into a house only to find lampshades made of human skin and bowls fashioned from human skulls. This was the home of Ed Gein, a man who, beneath his quiet exterior, hid a horrific secret. Known as the Butcher of Plainfield, Gein wasn't just a murderer. He was a grave robber who turned his victims into grotesque art pieces. His twisted obsession with death inspired some of the most iconic horror films, but the reality is far more terrifying. Edward Theodore Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield, or the Plainfield Ghoul, was an American murderer, suspected serial killer, and body snatcher. His crimes in and around Plainfield, Wisconsin, gained national attention in 1957 when authorities uncovered that he had exhumed bodies from local cemeteries and used their bones and skin to create gruesome keepsakes. Gein also admitted to killing two women, Mary Hogan, a tavern owner, in 1954, and Bernice Worden, a hardware store owner, in 1957. Gein was first deemed unfit for trial and was committed to a mental health institution. However, by 1968, he was declared competent to face trial and was found guilty of murdering Bernice Worden. Despite this, he was declared legally insane and was sent to a psychiatric facility. Gein passed away at the Mendota Mental Health Institute on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, due to respiratory failure caused by lung cancer. He is buried in Plainfield Cemetery alongside his family in a grave that is now unmarked. On the morning of November 16, 1957, 58-year-old Bernice Worden, the owner of a hardware store in Plainfield, went missing. Around 9:30 a.m., the store's truck was seen leaving from the back of the building. The store had very few customers that day, which some locals attributed to deer hunting season. Worden's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, arrived at the store around 5 o'clock to discover the cash register open and bloodstains on the floor. Frank Worden informed investigators that Gein had been in the store the previous evening and was expected to return the next morning to buy a gallon of antifreeze. The last sales receipt written by Worden that morning was for the antifreeze. Later that evening, Gein was arrested at a grocery store in West Plainfield, and the Washoe County Sheriff's Department searched his farm. A sheriff's deputy discovered Bernice Worden's decapitated body in a shed on Gein's property. She was found hanging upside down by her legs, with a crossbar at her ankles and ropes tied to her wrists. Her torso had been dressed out like a deer. Worden had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations were inflicted after her death. As authorities searched Gein's house, they made further disturbing discoveries. Whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chairs, skulls on his bedpost, female skulls, some with the tops sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's skull in a box, Bernice Worden's entire head in a burlap sack, Bernice Worden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Gein's potbelly stove, 9 vulvae in a shoebox, a young girl's dress, and the vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old. A belt made from female human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, fingernails from female fingers. Gein confessed to robbing 9 graves and led investigators to their locations. Alan Vilimovsky from the State Crime Lab assisted in exhuming 3 graves identified by Gein. The caskets were found inside wooden boxes, with the tops about 2 feet below the surface. Gein had stolen from these graves shortly after the funerals, while they were still incomplete. The exhumations confirmed Gein's account. One casket was empty, another held his crowbar, and a third had most of the body missing, although Gein had returned some rings and body parts. His confession was largely verified by these findings. Shortly after his mother's death, Gein started crafting a woman's suit, with the intention of becoming his mother to literally crawl into her skin. He denied having sexual relations with the exhumed bodies, stating, "They smelled too bad." During an interrogation by the state crime lab, Gein also confessed to killing 51-year-old Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had been missing since December 8, 1954, and whose head was discovered in his home. However, he later claimed to have no memory of the details surrounding her death. Gein passed away at the Mendota Mental Health Institute on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, due to respiratory failure caused by lung cancer. Over time, souvenir hunters chipped away at his gravestone in Plainfield Cemetery, eventually leading to its theft in 2000. The gravestone was recovered in June 2001 near Seattle, Washington, and is now stored at the Washoe County Sheriff's Department. Although his grave is now unmarked, its location is known, as Gein is buried between his parents and brother in the cemetery. Gein's story has had a lasting impact on American popular culture, appearing in various films, music, and literature. His tale first gained widespread attention in Robert Bloch's 1959 suspense novel Psycho, a fictionalized version of Gein's crimes. Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film adaptation of the novel, Psycho, further popularized the story. Gein's life has been loosely adapted into several films, including Deranged, 1974, In the Light of the Moon, 2000, released in the U.S., and Australia as Ed Gein, 2001. Ed Gein, The Butcher of Plainfield, 2007, Ed Gein, The Musical, 2010, and Rob Zombie's House of 1000 Corpses and its sequel, The Devil's Rejects. Gein also inspired numerous fictional serial killers, including Norman Bates, Psycho, Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill, The Silence of the Lambs, Garland Green, Con Air, and Dr. Oliver Thredson in the TV series American Horror Story, Asylum. Few killers have spread fear like Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker. His reign of terror in Los Angeles during the 1980s was marked by random, brutal attacks. Ramirez showed no mercy to his victims, slaughtering them in their homes while pledging allegiance to Satan. With no clear pattern to his crimes, the randomness of his brutality kept the entire city in fear. Was he a killer, or was he the embodiment of evil? Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, commonly known as Richard Ramirez and nicknamed the Night Stalker, was an American serial killer and sex offender. His killing spree took place in California's greater Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area. Between April 1984 and August 1985, Ramirez killed at least 14 people during a series of break-ins, most of which occurred in the afternoon. This earned him the nicknames Night Stalker, Walk-In Killer, and Valley Intruder. In 1989, he was convicted and sentenced to death, but he died in 2013 while awaiting execution. Ramirez's crime spree began in 1984 and continued through 1985. His method was unpredictable, adding to the terror he caused. He would enter homes in the middle of the night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and brutally attack his victims. His murders were particularly terrifying because there was no consistent pattern regarding the age, gender, or race of his victims. In his attacks, Ramirez employed a variety of weapons, including guns, knives, and blunt objects. He also raped many of his female victims, sometimes after killing their partners. His crimes ranged from shooting his victims to bludgeoning and stabbing them. He often left satanic symbols at the crime scenes, further terrifying the public and leaving authorities baffled. Some of the most chilling aspects of Ramirez's attacks were his psychological torment of his victims. He frequently told them to swear to Satan before attacking them. His sporadic targeting made people across Los Angeles live in constant fear, as anyone could become a victim. He gained the nickname Night Stalker because most of his attacks occurred at night. Ramirez's downfall began with his final attack on August 24, 1985, in Mission Viejo, California. After entering the home of Bill Carnes and his fiancée, Inez Erickson, he shot Carnes in the head and sexually assaulted Erickson. Miraculously, both survived the attack, and Erickson was able to provide a detailed description of Ramirez to the police. Crucially, Ramirez left a shoe print at the scene that matched prints from earlier crime scenes. In the days following the attack, authorities released Ramirez's mugshot from a prior arrest to the media. His face was plastered across newspapers and television broadcasts. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez was recognized by a group of citizens in East Los Angeles while attempting to steal a car. They chased him down, beating him until police arrived and arrested him. Ramirez was charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. His trial, which began in 1988, was one of the most sensationalized in U.S. history. Ramirez was defiant in court, often flashing a pentagram drawn on his hand and declaring his allegiance to Satan. He showed no remorse for his actions, further horrifying the public. Richard Ramirez died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma on June 7, 2013, after spending more than 2 decades on death row. Ramirez was drawn to the dark world of Satanism in his teens. He was already struggling with a violent upbringing, influenced by his cousin Mike, who exposed him to extreme violence and brutality. As he became more isolated and angry, Ramirez delved into Satanism, finding a perverse sense of identity and power in its imagery and philosophy. Ramirez was drawn to the dark world of Satanism in his teens. He was already struggling with a violent upbringing, influenced by his cousin Mike, who exposed him to extreme violence and brutality. As he became more isolated and angry, Ramirez delved into Satanism, finding a perverse sense of identity and power in its imagery and philosophy. Ramirez didn't just claim to follow Satanism privately, he actively used satanic rituals and symbols in his crime spree. In several of his attacks, he would command his victims to swear to Satan before assaulting or killing them. This psychological tactic, along with the violence itself, was meant to instill greater fear in his victims, heightening the power dynamic he relished. At multiple crime scenes, Ramirez left satanic symbols as a signature. For instance, he would draw pentagrams, a symbol often associated with occult practices, on walls or on his victims' bodies. In one case, after killing a woman, he smeared a pentagram on the wall of her home using her lipstick. These symbols were part of his ritualistic approach to murder, signifying his allegiance to dark forces. When Albert Fish wrote a letter to the family of a young girl he murdered, he didn't just confess to the crime, he detailed how he cannibalized her in one of the most disturbing letters in criminal history. Fish, known as the Gray Man, was a sadistic child killer and cannibal. His twisted mind believed in the power of pain and suffering, and he inflicted it with a level of cruelty that defies belief. Fish wasn't just a predator, he was a living nightmare. Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was an American serial killer, rapist, child molester, and cannibal responsible for at least 3 child murders between July 1924 and June 1928. He was also known by several nicknames, including the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and the Boogeyman. Although he was a suspect in at least 10 murders throughout his life, Fish only confessed to 3 killings that police were able to link to known homicides. He also admitted to stabbing at least 2 other people. Fish once claimed that he had children in every state, and suggested that his total number of victims was around 100, though it is unclear whether he was referring to rape, cannibalism, or both, and the truthfulness of the statement remains uncertain. He was arrested on December 13, 1934, and subsequently tried for the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd. Fish was found guilty and was executed by electric chair on January 16, 1936, at the age of 65. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His early life was marked by significant hardship and tragedy. His father was 75 years old at the time of Fish's birth, and he died when Albert was just 5 years old. His mother, unable to care for him, placed him in an orphanage, where Fish experienced extreme abuse. It was during this time that he began to develop a fascination with pain and sadomasochism, traits that would later define his criminal behavior. From a young age, Fish showed signs of mental illness. Several members of his family had a history of severe mental health issues, including hallucinations and religious mania, and Fish would inherit many of these traits. He developed a wide range of deviant behaviors, including masochism, self-harm, and an obsession with religion, particularly focusing on the concept of punishment and suffering. Fish would often whip himself with a paddle embedded with nails and needles. Albert Fish's crimes spanned decades, but it wasn't until later in his life that his actions came to public attention. His primary targets were children, and he lured them by posing as a friendly old man. Fish's ability to appear harmless and unassuming allowed him to evade suspicion for years. Behind this facade, however, was a man consumed by depraved fantasies involving torture, murder, and cannibalism. Fish claimed to have killed at least 3 children, though he hinted at far more victims during his confessions. His acts were ritualistic and rooted in his sadomasochistic tendencies. He enjoyed inflicting pain on others, but also derived pleasure from inflicting pain on himself. His murders often involved extreme cruelty, including dismemberment and cannibalism, making him one of the most horrifying figures in criminal history. Fish's crimes became notorious for their graphic nature, especially his obsession with consuming human flesh. He claimed to believe that eating his victims would give him power and spiritual sustenance. His cannibalism was deeply tied to his religious delusions, as he believed he was acting under divine guidance. The crime that ultimately led to Fish's capture was the murder of Grace Budd, an 8-year-old girl who became one of his most infamous victims. In May 1928, Fish answered an advertisement placed by Edward Budd, Grace's older brother, who was looking for work. Posing as Frank Howard, a farmer, Fish visited the Budd family in Manhattan, pretending to offer Edward a job on his farm. However, his true intention was to abduct a child. During his visit, Fish took an interest in Grace. He convinced the Budd family to let him take Grace to a supposed birthday party for his niece, promising to bring her back later that day. Grace was never seen alive again. For 6 years, the fate of Grace Budd remained a mystery. It wasn't until 1934 that Fish made a chilling confession in the form of a letter sent to Grace's mother. In the letter, Fish described in graphic detail how he had lured Grace to an empty house, murdered her, and then cooked and ate parts of her body. The letter's contents were so horrifying that they shocked even seasoned investigators. The letter provided police with a critical clue, an envelope with an emblem that helped them track down the boarding house where Fish had stayed. Through this investigation, they eventually arrested him in November 1934. After his arrest, Fish confessed to the murder of Grace Budd and also claimed responsibility for the deaths of 2 other children, Francis McDonnell and Billy Gaffney. Both boys had been murdered in similar brutal fashions, with Fish again confessing to cannibalizing parts of their bodies. Fish's trial began in March 1935, and his defense team sought to portray him as insane, which many argued he was. Fish's disturbing psychiatric history, combined with the extreme nature of his crimes, made his mental state a significant point of contention during the trial. He openly talked about hearing voices, being instructed by God to kill children, and deriving pleasure from pain and suffering. Despite the horrific details of his crimes and the clear evidence of his mental instability, the jury found him sane and guilty of the murder of Grace Budd. Fish was sentenced to death by electrocution. On January 16, 1936, at the age of 65, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in New York. Before his execution, he remained calm and even reportedly said that electrocution would be the supreme thrill. His lack of remorse and continued sadomasochistic behavior until the very end shocked even the prison staff. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, Robert Hansen lived a quiet life as a respected baker. But behind the facade, Hansen harbored dark desires. He would abduct women, fly them into remote areas of Alaska, release them, and then hunt them down with a rifle like animals. Hansen's disturbing pleasure in human hunting went undetected for years, hiding behind the respectability of his everyday life. How could someone so normal conceal something so terrifying? Robert Christian Bose Hansen, widely known as the Butcher Baker, was an American serial killer who operated in Anchorage, Alaska, between 1972 and 1983. Hansen abducted, raped, and murdered at least 17 women, often releasing his victims into the wilderness where he would hunt them with a Ruger Mini-14 rifle and hunting knives. He was apprehended in 1983 and sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Hansen died of natural causes in 2014 at the age of 75. Hansen is believed to have begun his killing spree around 1972. His method typically involved stalking women to learn their routines before abducting them at gunpoint, taking them to his home where he would rape them, and then transporting them to a secluded area. In some cases, he would release them into the wilderness and hunt them as if they were wild game, before killing them by shooting or stabbing. Many of his victims were sex workers or teenagers. Authorities suspect Hansen's first victim was 18-year-old Celia Van Zanten, who was kidnapped on December 22, 1971, and died from exposure after escaping. However, there is no conclusive evidence linking Hansen to her abduction, and he denied involvement. On June 13, 1983, Hansen offered 17-year-old Cindy Paulson $200 for oral sex. After she entered his car, he pulled a gun and took her to his home, where he raped and tortured her. Paulson later told police that Hansen chained her by the neck in his basement and took a nap. When he woke up, he took her to an airport with plans to fly her to a remote cabin. While Hansen was distracted loading his airplane, Paulson escaped, fleeing to a nearby street and eventually reaching safety. In June 1983, Cindy Paulson escaped from Robert Hansen after being abducted, raped, and tortured. She told police she left her blue sneakers in Hansen's car as evidence. After fleeing, she flagged down a truck driven by Robert Yount, who took her to a hotel. Yount then reported the incident to the police. Police later found Paulson at another motel, still handcuffed. She provided a detailed description of Hansen, but he denied the allegations, claiming she was extorting him. His calm demeanor, occupation as a baker, and an alibi from a friend made police initially dismiss him as a suspect. Detective Glenn Floth of the Alaska State Troopers had been investigating multiple bodies found in the Anchorage area, believed to be linked. He worked with FBI profiler John Douglas, who suggested the killer was likely a skilled hunter with low self-esteem, a history of rejection by women, and a tendency to keep souvenirs from his victims. Douglas also suggested the killer might stutter, which fit Hansen's profile. With Paulson's testimony and the profile, authorities obtained a warrant to search Hansen's properties. They discovered jewelry belonging to missing women, firearms, and a map with X marks indicating locations where bodies had been found. Confronted with this evidence, Hansen eventually confessed to a series of attacks and murders dating back to 1971. His early victims were young women, typically aged 16 to 19, and were not sex workers, unlike some of the later victims. In 1984, Hansen was convicted of multiple murders, assaults, and kidnappings. He was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison, ensuring that he would never be released. Hansen spent the rest of his life in prison, where he died in 2014 at the age of 75 from natural causes. The story of Robert Hansen, the butcher baker, remains one of the most harrowing cases in the history of American serial killers. His calculated cruelty, combined with his ability to live a double life as a respected family man and business owner, left a chilling legacy in the true crime world. The fact that he used Alaska's rugged and isolated wilderness as a killing field, where he could hunt his victims like animals, made his crimes uniquely horrifying. Hansen's gruesome story was the inspiration for films and documentaries, most notably the 2013 movie The Frozen Ground, starring John Cusack as Hansen and Nicolas Cage as the detective who pursued him. His case remains a disturbing example of how a seemingly ordinary individual can harbor unspeakable evil beneath the facade of normalcy. David Parker Ray had a soundproof trailer he called the Toy Box, but this wasn't a place for games. It was a torture chamber equipped with tools designed to inflict pain. His victims were subjected to unimaginable horrors, and many never survived to tell the tale. Ray's crimes were so shocking that even law enforcement officers struggled to believe the full extent of his depravity. His chilling recordings, played to victims before their torment began, made him the true definition of a monster. Ray soundproofed a semi-trailer, which he referred to as his toy box, and outfitted it with equipment for sexual torture. He kidnapped approximately 4 to 5 women per year, keeping each captive for 2 to 3 months. During their captivity, Ray would sexually abuse and torture his victims, often using surgical instruments. At times, he invited his friends, his wife, or even his male dog to participate in the assaults. After holding them for several months, Ray would drug his victims with barbiturates, hoping to erase their memories, before abandoning them on the side of a road. Ray was arrested in March 1999 after one of his victims managed to escape. In 2001, he was convicted of kidnapping and torture and received a lengthy prison sentence. However, he was never tried for murder due to insufficient evidence. Ray died from a heart attack on May 28, 2002, just before a scheduled police interrogation. Ray sexually tortured and likely killed his victims using various tools, including whips, chains, pulleys, straps, clamps, leg spreader bars, surgical blades, electric shock devices, and saws. He is believed to have terrorized many women over the years, often with the assistance of accomplices, including some of the women he dated. His torture chamber was a soundproof cargo trailer outside his property in Elephant Butte, New Mexico, which he referred to as the Toy Box. This trailer was filled with sex toys, torture instruments, syringes, detailed diagrams for inflicting pain, and a homemade generator for delivering electrical shocks. In total, Ray is thought to have spent $100,000 outfitting the trailer with these torture devices and tools. Ray reportedly built elaborate devices to restrain his victims, including a fur-lined coffin and a makeshift pillory. He also used complex locks and pulleys to prevent their escape. Above the obstetric table where he strapped down his victims, he installed a mirror on the ceiling, forcing them to watch as they were raped and tortured. Ray wanted his victims to see everything he did to them. Additionally, he used wooden devices to bend his victims over and immobilize them, while allowing his dogs and sometimes other accomplices to assault them. He would often play an audio recording of his voice for his victims when they regained consciousness. In his recorded tapes, Ray explained how he would occasionally release his captives after severely drugging them with barbiturates to induce amnesia, leaving them on a country road. This memory loss would prevent them from recalling or reporting the assaults. Ray reportedly abducted around 4 to 5 women per year, holding each captive for 2 to 3 months. The exact number of his murder victims remains unclear. Investigators believe he raped, tortured, and killed up to 60 people throughout his life, though no remains have ever been found. Ray kept a diary documenting what he did to each victim, but it did not reveal where he buried their bodies. According to his accomplice, Cindy Hindi, Ray's victims were dismembered and either buried, dumped in Elephant Butte Lake, or disposed of in nearby ravines. After his arrest, Ray offered to lead authorities to the burial sites, but he died before doing so, and Hindi was unable to assist in locating any bodies. Cynthia Vigil was abducted from a parking lot in Albuquerque by Ray and his girlfriend, Cindy Hindi. She was taken to Ray's trailer in Elephant Butte, where she was confined and tortured. After 3 days of captivity, Vigil managed to escape on March 22, 1999. She waited until Ray went to work, then used keys left on a table by Hindi to unlock her chains. When Hindi noticed Vigil's escape attempt, a struggle broke out, during which Hindi hit Vigil with a lamp. Despite this, Vigil freed herself and stabbed Hindi in the neck with an ice pick. Vigil fled, wearing only a metal slave collar and padlock chains, and sought help from a nearby homeowner, who took her in, comforted her, and called the police. Her escape led authorities to Ray's trailer and resulted in the arrests of Ray and Hindi. A judge ruled that the cases involving Cynthia Vigil, Angelica Montano, and Kelly Garrett would be tried separately, which weakened the prosecution's case, as each victim's testimony could have supported the others. The judge also excluded much of the evidence found during the 1999 raid in the cases of Montano and Garrett, including an incriminating audio tape of Ray describing his methods. Ray's first trial, for crimes against Kelly Garrett, ended in a mistrial when 2 jurors found her testimony unbelievable. Ray's defense claimed that the activities in his sex trailer were consensual. After a retrial, Ray was convicted on all 12 charges. In 2001, Ray accepted a plea deal during his trial for crimes against Vigil to reduce his daughter's sentence. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison for the abduction and torture of 3 women. His daughter, Glenda Jean Jessie Ray, pled no contest to kidnapping and criminal sexual penetration and received a 30-month sentence with 5 years of probation. In 1999, accomplice Dennis Roy Yancey pled guilty to the 1997 murder of Marie Parker, confessing that Ray forced him to strangle Parker after torturing her. Yancey was sentenced to 30 years, but was paroled in 2011 before being reincarcerated for a parole violation. He remained in custody until 2021. Cindy Hindi, another accomplice, was sentenced to 36 years in 2000 for her role in the crimes. She was released on July 15, 2019, after serving part of her parole in prison. On May 28, 2002, Ray was transported to the Lee County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico, for questioning by state police. However, he died of a heart attack before the interrogation could occur,